All right, let's dive right in. We are about to tackle one of the most transformative, most disruptive, and honestly, most important periods in all of human history, the Age of Revolutions, from about 1750 to 1900. Understanding what happened here is absolutely foundational to making sense of the modern world, and it's for sure central to crushing it on the AP World History exam. So here's our game plan. In this session, we're going to analyze what historians call the twin revolutions, the political one and the industrial one. We'll break it down into these 6 key pieces, starting with the ideas that lit the fuse and going all the way to how society was completely remade. By the end of this, you'll be able to explain the causes, the effects, and most importantly, the connections between these two massive movements. That's a skill you've got to have. First things first, before any barricades went up in the streets, before a single factory started churning out smoke, there was a revolution of the mind. This was a fundamental shift in how people, especially in Europe, thought about everything: power, rights, and even human nature itself. So what was the Enlightenment? Well, it was all about taking the methods of the scientific revolution, using reason, using evidence, this idea of empiricism, and applying them to human beings and their societies. Philosophers started arguing that reason, not just tradition or some king's divine right, should be our guide for how we organize ourselves. And that, right there, was a direct challenge to the power of the church and the state. You've got these intellectual heavy hitters like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, and they're basically creating a whole new political vocabulary. The idea that you're born with natural rights. The idea that you need to separate government powers so no one gets too powerful. And maybe the biggest one of all, the idea that a government is only legitimate if the people agree to be governed, the social contract. These weren't just thoughts, they were weapons aimed right at the heart of absolute monarchy. Locke's words here just nail the core of this new way of thinking. The whole point of government, he's saying, isn't to control you, it's to protect and grow your freedom. I mean, think about that. That is a complete 180 from centuries of political thought that was all about obedience and control. But here's the million-dollar question, right? When these philosophers were talking about mankind and natural rights, who were they really talking about? Because while these ideas sounded universal, in practice they were anything but. Let's dig into who was left out, especially when it came to gender. So, what happens? You get these incredible women, these early feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympia de Gouges, who basically grab the Enlightenment's own rulebook and use it against the existing power structures. They argued, hey, if reason and natural rights are universal, then they have to apply to us too. This line of thinking leads directly to landmark moments like the Seneca Falls Conference, where women formally demanded the right to vote and to be treated as equals. Okay, so we've got the idea simmering. How do we get from these philosophical debates in fancy salons to people literally building barricades in the streets? This next part is all about tracing that path, seeing how these intellectual sparks caught fire and fueled revolutions all over the Atlantic. And suddenly, it's like a chain reaction. Boom, the American Revolution kicks off in 1776. Then, boom, the French Revolution in 1789. Then the Haitian Revolution, an incredibly important and radical slave revolt that creates a new nation. And then, a whole wave of independence movements sweeps across Latin America. People everywhere, from colonial subjects to everyday citizens, are rising up, inspired by these new ideas of democracy and liberty. And look at this line right here. This isn't just a nice phrase. This is Enlightenment philosophy translated directly into a political reality. It's practically ripped from the pages of Locke and Rousseau and slapped right into one of the most important documents of the modern era. It's the perfect example of how ideas can drive real world-changing action. And brewing alongside all this is a brand new and incredibly powerful idea: nationalism. It's this feeling of being part of a team, what's been called an imagined community. The idea that you share a deep connection with millions of people you'll never meet just because you share a language or a culture or a history. Now, this force could build new countries like it did in Germany and Italy, but it could also tear old ones apart, creating deep cracks in huge multi-ethnic empires like the Ottoman Empire. All right, let's hit pause for a second. This is a self-assessment moment. I want you to actually pause and try to name one specific nationalist movement from this era and tell me its main goal. Go on, give it a shot. Okay, you back? You might have thought of something like the propaganda movement in the Philippines, which was all about seeking reforms from Spain. Or maybe you thought about the unification of Germany under Bismarck, whose goal was to bring all these little German states together into one powerful nation. Both are great examples. Okay, let's shift gears, because happening at the exact same time as all of this political drama is the other twin revolution. And this one changes everything about how we work, how we live, where we live, and how we interact with the planet itself. This was the revolution in production. So, why Britain? Why did it all start on this one relatively small island? Well, it was kind of like a perfect storm of factors. They had tons of coal and iron, and they were located right next to each other. They had rivers and canals to move stuff around. Their farms were getting more productive, which meant you needed fewer farmers and had more people available for other work. Plus, they had laws protecting private property and a ton of capital from global trade just waiting to be invested. It was this unique combo that kicked everything off. And the technology just exploded. It all started with the steam engine, figuring out how to harness the incredible power of coal. That directly led to the factory system. Then, boom, a second industrial revolution hits in the later 1800s with huge advances in steel, chemicals, and electricity. And on top of all that, things like railroads and the telegraph completely changed the game, making the world feel smaller and more connected than ever before. But here's a super important point, especially for the AP exam. Not everyone industrialized the same way. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all model. In Britain, it was mostly driven by individuals, by entrepreneurs looking to make a profit. But in places like Meiji Japan or in Egypt under Muhammad Ali, it was the state, the government that led the charge. Their motivation wasn't just profit, it was defense. It was a desperate race to modernize so they wouldn't get taken over by the West. So what's the fuel for this massive industrial engine? It's a new economic system called capitalism. Let's look at how this system worked and how it almost immediately generated some pretty powerful criticisms. So the old way of thinking, mercantilism, was all about the government controlling the economy to hoard as much gold and silver as possible. Adam Smith comes along and basically says, nope, let's try something different. Let's have the government take its hands off. This idea, laissez-faire capitalism, argued that free markets and competition would actually create more wealth for everyone in the long run. And that became the dominant idea of the age. And to make all this global trade and industry work, you needed new financial tools. So you see the rise of things we're very familiar with today: stock markets, giant transnational companies like HSBC, and this really clever idea of limited liability corporations, which protected investors and encouraged them to risk their money on big projects. This was the financial machinery that powered industrialization. But, and this is a huge but, this system was creating incredible wealth, but also incredible inequality. And that led to a massive intellectual backlash, most famously from Karl Marx. He looked at the industrial world and said, this isn't progress, this is just a new form of class warfare. He argued you had the bourgeoisie, the owners, getting rich, and the proletariat, the workers, being exploited. His ideas would form the basis for socialism and communism, which called for a total reboot of society. So let's get down to what this all actually felt like for people on the ground. How did this new machine age completely restructure society and change daily life forever? Well, for one, you have these brand new social classes that didn't really exist before. A massive industrial working class and a growing middle class of managers and professionals. Families changed too. People flooded into cities, which grew so fast they became polluted, overcrowded, and dangerous. In response to the terrible working conditions in factories, workers started banding together, forming labor unions to fight for better pay, shorter hours, and basic safety. Okay, let's bring it all home. This is the crucial synthesis part. We can't think of these revolutions as two separate stories running side by side. We have to understand how they interacted, how they collided, and how together they forged the modern world. This chart is your best friend for studying this unit. On one hand, you have the political revolutions, driven by ideas like liberty and asking the big question, who gets to rule? On the other hand, you have the industrial revolution, driven by efficiency and profit, asking how do we produce things? They had different actors and different goals, but their outcomes, new nations, new classes, a new global economy, were completely tangled up with each other. All right, one last challenge for you. This is a top-tier AP skill right here. Pause and try to write a single, solid thesis statement that answers the question on the screen. How did these two revolutions connect and conflict? Give it a real shot. Okay, a good thesis might sound something like this. While the Industrial Revolution created the wealth that helped build new nations, it also produced such massive social inequality that it directly challenged the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality for all. See how that brings both sides together? And that really brings us full circle, because all of those huge, messy debates they were having back then about the balance between freedom and order, about who deserves rights, about the government's role in the economy, and about fairness and inequality, sound familiar? They should, because they are the very same conversations we are still having all over the world today. In many ways, the age of revolutions never really ended. Industrialization didn't just build factories, it literally redrew the map of the entire world. In this explainer, we're going to trace that direct line from the steam engine to the global empires it created. We're going to uncover a chain of events that didn't just reshape continents, but continues to define the world we live in today. All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the powerful ideas, the rationales, that empires used to justify what they were doing. Then, we'll see how those ideas were put into practice through massive expansion.
After that, we'll break down the global economic machine they built. And, this is so important, we'll explore how people fought back and how huge populations were forced to move across the globe. By the end of this, you won't just know the facts, you'll be able to analyze the complex cause and effect chain that built our modern world. So how in the world do you justify conquering an entire continent? Well, it wasn't just done with guns, it was done with ideas. Let's dig into the core arguments that imperial powers used to convince themselves and the world that they had the right to rule over others. Let's be real, at its heart, the main driver was economic. The second industrial revolution was an absolute beast, and it was always hungry. It needed insane amounts of raw materials. We're talking rubber from the Congo, cotton from Egypt, palm oil from West Africa, just to keep the factories running. And once those factories turned out all those finished goods, well, they needed new places to sell them. Empire was the perfect, if incredibly brutal solution to both of these problems. But we want to make more money isn't a very inspiring slogan. So to justify all this, a really powerful and frankly dangerous new ideology came about, social Darwinism. Now, let's be crystal clear. This was not science. It was a twisted misapplication of Darwin's theories of evolution to human societies. It basically created a fake racial hierarchy, with white Europeans at the very top, arguing that it was just natural for them to dominate everyone else. This gave a sort of scientific-sounding excuse to what was really just conquest and exploitation. And this quote right here from Rudyard Kipling's poem is the perfect example of the civilizing mission. This ideology said that imperialism wasn't really about profit. Oh no. It was a noble, difficult duty to bring things like Christianity, Western education, and civilization to what they called the backward peoples of the world. It was a very powerful, very paternalistic, and deeply racist justification. Okay, so with these justifications locked and loaded, how did these industrial countries actually go out and build their empires? Let's pivot now from the why to the how, and look at the methods of expansion, which were both technologically shocking and ruthlessly efficient. Just look at these two maps. On the left, you've got Africa in the late 1800s, a continent full of diverse, independent kingdoms and states. Now look at the map on the right, just a couple of decades later. It's almost unrecognizable, carved up by European powers. This was the infamous scramble for Africa, a wild period of competition made possible by new tech like the steamship, which could travel up rivers, and the Maxim gun, which created a massive military imbalance. So how did they actually control these huge new territories? Well, you see two main approaches. On one hand, you've got direct state expansion. This is where governments themselves, using armies and diplomats, took over. We also see a big shift here, moving away from rule by private companies, like the famous Dutch East India Company, to direct rule from London or Paris. On the other hand, you have settler colonies. Think places like New Zealand or South Africa, where huge numbers of Europeans actually moved in to live permanently, pushing out the indigenous peoples and basically trying to recreate their own societies. Now, these empires weren't just about political power or flags on a map. They were massive economic systems, specifically designed to funnel wealth and resources back to the industrial centers in Europe. Let's break down how that engine worked. The system created what we now call export economies. Basically, colonies were totally transformed to become specialized suppliers for the colonizing country. I want you to imagine your entire region, which for centuries produced all sorts of different foods and goods for local people, is now forced to produce only cotton or only rubber. This completely shattered local economies and created this deep dependency that, in a lot of ways, is still around today. This table gives you a fantastic snapshot of what I'm talking about. Egypt's economy was totally re-engineered to grow cotton for Britain's textile mills. The Congo Basin was brutally exploited for rubber, which was needed for industrial belts and tires. West Africa for palm oil. And get this, even guano, which is basically bird droppings from Peru, became this super important fertilizer for farms in Europe. Each place was turned into a specialized cog in the giant industrial machine. But control didn't always require an invading army. A lot of times, economic imperialism was way more subtle. Instead of sending soldiers, a country like Britain might finance a railroad in Argentina. That investment gave them huge control over Argentina's trade without ever planting a flag. A more extreme example, of course, is the Opium Wars, where Britain literally used its military to force China into an economic relationship that was absolutely devastating for the Chinese. Okay, this next part is so important. We absolutely cannot look at this history as a one-way street. The people being colonized were not just passive victims, they responded, they resisted, and they rebelled in all sorts of creative and powerful ways. So was this expansion accepted passively? The answer is a huge, definitive no. Resistance was constant. It was everywhere. It took the form of everything from full-blown wars to spiritual movements, from organized political groups to simple, everyday acts of defiance. These responses weren't just reactions. They actively shaped how colonialism unfolded. A great early example is the rebellion led by Tupac Amaru II in Peru. He didn't just fight against the Spanish for economic reasons. He very deliberately drew on the powerful memory and identity of the once great Inca Empire to unite indigenous peoples. It's a perfect case of how resistance was so often rooted in pre-colonial history and culture. We can actually categorize these responses to help us understand them better. You have direct state-on-state warfare, like the long bloody wars between the Asante Kingdom and the British. You have the rise of new nationalist movements, like the huge Sepoy Rebellion in India, which we'll get to in a sec. And you have these powerful rebellions driven by religion and spirituality, like the Mahdist War in Sudan, or the absolutely tragic Kozak cattle killing movement in Southern Africa. Each one tells a unique story about the human response to being conquered. Okay, this is a perfect opportunity to practice a key historical thinking skill, comparison. I want you to pause right here and jot down a few notes comparing the core motivations of the Indian Mutiny and the Xhosa cattle killing movement. Go ahead. All right, you back? The Indian Mutiny, or Sepoy Rebellion, was first and foremost a political and military uprising. It was started by trained soldiers, the Sepoys, reacting to British policies that disrespected their religions and took power away from their local leaders. Their goal was straightforward: kick the British out and take back control. The Xhosa cattle killing movement was completely different. It was a spiritual and prophetic movement. Facing disease and losing their land, the Xhosa people followed prophecy that said if they destroyed their own wealth, their cattle and crops, their ancestors would rise up and sweep the Europeans into the sea. So one was a fight for political power, the other was a spiritual act of desperation. Understanding that difference is huge. Imperialism didn't just move raw materials and armies around the world. It moved people. We're talking millions of people on a scale that had never been seen before. The huge demand for labor, combined with the chaos of conquest, created a world on the move. And this migration came in a few different flavors. On one side, you have coerced labor. Now, even though slavery was being abolished in most places, the need for cheap workers didn't go away. This led to systems like indentured servitude, where millions of Indian and Chinese laborers signed harsh contracts to work on plantations or build railroads. But at the same time, there was also massive voluntary migration, as millions of people, especially from Europe and Asia, chose to leave their homes to escape things like poverty and persecution, looking for a better life. The effects of all this movement were profound. Back in the home societies, women often had to take on totally new roles, as so many men left to find work. In their new countries, migrants created ethnic enclaves, think of Chinatowns or Little Italies, that were vital for preserving their culture, but also marked them as different. And this often led to a backlash. The receiving societies frequently reacted with racism and prejudice, which led to laws designed to stop immigration, like the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US. These dynamics created social tensions that, in many ways, are still with us. All right, let's pull all these threads together. We've looked at the individual links in the chain, now let's step back and look at the entire chain of causation that really defines this entire period. Here it is, step by step. First, industrialization creates the need for resources and markets. Second, ideologies like social Darwinism pop up to justify going out and getting them. Third, states use their military and economic power to expand. Fourth, the people being colonized fight back in a variety of ways. Fifth, this whole process causes massive shifts in global migration. And the final result, a new, deeply interconnected, but also profoundly unequal global order is born. So why does any of this matter to you right now? Well, just look at a map of the world. A lot of those unnaturally straight-line borders you see in Africa and the Middle East, they were drawn by Europeans in a conference room with zero regard for the people living there, and they are still sources of conflict today. Look at the global economy. Ever heard of the resource curse, where a country has tons of natural resources but its people are still poor? That's a direct echo of the export economies we just talked about. The patterns of wealth and poverty we see in the world today didn't just happen by accident. They were largely designed during this era. Let's wrap up with one final challenge to get you thinking like a historian. To what extent was imperialism a greater force for economic change than for social change in the 19th century? I want you to pause and actually try to outline a response. You'd have to weigh the evidence, compare the creation of these new global economies against the creation of new racial hierarchies and the massive social disruption of migration. There isn't one simple right answer. The skill is in building your argument with solid evidence, and mastering that skill is what will get you a 5